Thank you very much for being with us. Evan Gershkovich is heading home to the United States after a prisoner swap was agreed with Russia. He was sentenced to 16 years in prison by a Moscow court last month on spying charges, charges denied both by Gershkovich and his employer, the Wall Street Journal. US President Joe Biden said he has spoken with the released prisoners and their families, and Vice President Kamala Harris is cutting short campaigning for the election to head to Washington to help welcome them back home. One of the Russians freed is Vadim Krasikov, a hitman held by Germany for killing a Chechen exile in Berlin in 2019. Emerald Maxwell with this report.
Russian government planes land in Ankara amid a major prisoner swap between Russia and Belarus and the West. An exchange that includes American Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, whose unusually quick trial and conviction by Moscow on espionage charges last month hinted that a deal was in the works. As a rule, swaps can happen only after a conviction. But Moscow wasn't going to give up Gershkovich without getting something in return.
The relevant services in the US and Russia are in constant contact with one another. And of course, they will decide only on a reciprocal basis.
Russia's long been interested in getting back Vadim Krasikov, who was imprisoned in Germany for killing a former Chechen rebel commander in a Berlin park, apparently on Moscow's orders. Over the last few days, there had been signs that an exchange was imminent. Prisoners in Russia mysteriously being moved from their prisons and disappearing from view, including Paul Whelan, a former US Marine who was detained on spying charges while visiting Moscow in 2018, and Vladimir Kara-Murza, a Russian-British dissident, as well as several jailed Russian opposition figures, Ilya Yashin, veteran Russian human rights defender Oleg Orlov, artist Sasha Skochelenko, and two allies of the late opposition politician Alexei Navalny. Meanwhile, a number of high-profile Russian citizens held in US prisons appear to have been removed from the American federal prisoner database. And on Wednesday, a Slovenian court sentenced two Russians, seen here covering their faces, to prison time for espionage, but then immediately ordered their expulsion from the country. A move Slovenian media said was part of the wider exchange between Russia and the West, the biggest since the Cold War.
A highly significant, wide-ranging operation and the jewel in the crown in many ways. Evan Gershkovich now heading back to the United States, the Wall Street Journal reporter having been detained first in Russia in March last year. US President Joe Biden spoke a little earlier.
Made this possible was a feat of diplomacy and friendship. Multiple countries helped get this done. They joined the difficult, complex negotiations at my request, and I personally thank them all again. So for anyone who questions whether allies matter, they do. They matter. And today is a powerful example of why it's vital to have friends in this world.
Friendship and diplomacy. Oh, what matters, says Joe Biden. Let's bring in Fraser Jackson in Washington. Fraser, give us the story from the Washington angle. Friendship, diplomacy, says Biden. We also hear no money was exchanged at all.
Yeah, no money, no sanctions. That is what has been confirmed by Jake Sullivan at the podium of the White House press briefing room just a few moments ago. This has been a long effort in diplomacy, months in the offing. That is what we've been hearing. And it is something that the Biden administration started even before they got into office. We are told that Joe Biden instructed his national security team to start looking into all of the Americans who were detained abroad whilst he was still in the transitional period of his presidency before he actually took office. And over the time that he's been in office, he's managed to free 70 Americans from a variety of countries. But this, it must be said, is probably the jewel in the crown, as you indeed said. This has been the highest profile prisoner swap with the Russians since the Cold War. They are a total of 24 prisoners that have been moved, 16 moving westwards with 8 going back to Russia. And it was a difficult job to get over the line. line. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, has been pushing this plan with the various members of the allies that the United States has been using for this deal, and floated the idea to the German Chancellor Scholz a few months ago. And we are told ultimately it was quite a big ask to get Vadim Krasikov back from Germany, because there was going to be such blowback. And indeed, we are hearing that blowback is already beginning in Germany. The man accused, who's been convicted rather, of assassinating a Georgian national in a park in Berlin in 2019. So there was a bit of a bit of a political risk for Scholz to take to allow this man to be freed from Germany. But we are told that during a meeting between Joe Biden and Scholz in the White House in February, he said that he would do it and said, "For you, I will do it." That was the quote that we are being given by senior administration officials. That wasn't the done deal, though. It was still a few more months before all the final pieces came into play. The final piece of the puzzle was a call that Joe Biden put into his Slovenian counterpart, and we are told that that took place just 1 hour before Joe Biden announced that he would no longer be seeking re-election for November's election. So we are told that it was at that point, on that Sunday, that deal was basically signed between the allies, and it was just then a case of waiting to see if and when it would actually transpire. But confidence grew steadily until we started getting rumors about this a couple of days ago, when we heard about those Russian prisoner transfers, people going missing within the Russian prison system. And then we started asking sources and figuring out whether this was a deal that was going to be available and going to be viable. And indeed, it seemed like it was. But of course, for operational reasons, a lot of it had to be kept under wraps until those Americans and Germans and Russian political prisoners were safely out of Russian custody and in the hands of the US and Germany.
Kamala Harris heading back to assist in the welcoming back ceremony.
Yes, she will be heading to Joint Base Andrews, the Air Force base just outside of DC, which is used to being used by the president as he often flies around the country for various engagements. But it's also where they are going to be welcomed back. Kamala Harris, we are also told, had a very key role in all of these negotiations. She was present in a lot of the discussions with Scholz and the other European allies who have been involved in this transfer, including Poland, Slovenia, and Norway. So she has had a very active role. That is something that the White House has been made very evident. They also said, however, that the deal that was signed was classic Joe Biden. That was the words of Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor. He said that he gathered American allies to get Americans home from the grips of the opposition. So a real team effort, it's been touted as here at the White House, but there is a real mood of happiness and joy that has descended not only over the administration, but also over the press corps as well, as some of their own come home.
Evan Gershkovich heading back to the US. Fraser Jackson, thank you for that take from Washington, D.C. Let's bring in Douglas Herbert, our international affairs commentator, for more on this. Why did the Gershkovich case become the focal point of this?
Namely, he was the first American journalist detained on trumped-up espionage charges, spying charges, really since the height of the Cold War. So it's been decades and decades since we'd seen anything like it, even if we had seen the atmosphere in Russia, especially for press freedom, freedom of expression, really darkening in recent years amid a crackdown, a general crackdown against journalists and civil society, more broadly speaking. You know, Russian state media reported today that Vladimir Putin had signed a decree pardoning several of those released from Russian jails today, including Evan Gershkovich. And there's a real arch irony in that, Mark, that Putin pardons Gershkovich from the perspective of the West, from the perspective of his newspaper, from the perspective of the U.S. government, from the perspective of many people across the world looking in from the outside on this case. This was a purely politically motivated case, baseless. Russia never produced any evidence for the charges that it had laid down against Gershkovich, namely that he was assigned by the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, to gather secret information about a military factory in the Urals region where he had been reporting. He was arrested in the Urals capital of Yekaterinburg in March 2023. They've called this all baseless and farcical. And the White House had gone further, and a lot of people echoed this line, that the crime, if he was guilty of any crime, he was guilty of committing journalism, because what he was essentially doing is what journalists do. Talking to people, trying to get all sides of the story, asking for public records, trying to get access to as much information as he can. In today's Russia, from the perspective of even a lot of the state-run media, what Evan Gershkovich was doing is essentially spying, because journalism, in the sense of investigative journalism, simply is not allowed to exist there anymore. So it's a skewed worldview. They can say with a straight face
it just isn't a case of something being lost in translation, though, is it? There was a clear strategy behind
there was a
what
strategy
Putin did in arresting him and charging him. Yeah.
Let's put aside the fact that the Russians are calling him a spy, and because he was doing journalism. The strategy has been to essentially false imprisonment. What do I mean by that? Using American citizens, not just Americans, but others. But in this case, Evan Gershkovich, an American citizen, Russian background. His parents had moved to the U.S. When he was born in the U.S., though. Using American citizens as pawns in order for Russia to achieve its political objectives, its political ends. In this case, what are the political ends? Well, we saw it in the Brittany Griner case when she was detained. She was swapped. It was a one-on-one swap for one of the world's most notorious arms dealers, Victor Bout. In this case, this was a swap again. You could say that, yeah, they got a lot of extraction. They got a lot of concessions from the Kremlin. A lot of high-profile figures were released in this swap from Russian jails. But in return, Russia's getting back one of the world's most notorious serial hitmen, Vadim Krasikov. This is a man who, even before he knocked off a Chechen in a central Berlin park, had also been a high-level colonel in the FSB in Russia and had been allegedly involved in crimes there. So, yeah, he had become a high-profile case across the world, Evan, because it was seen as such a farcical and such an egregious abuse of the justice system for political purposes.
Douglas Herbert, thank you very much indeed. Douglas Herbert, our international affairs commentator. Great to see you, sir. We continue with our analysis of this story, this massive prisoner swap that has happened, described as huge. From the White House perspective, and Evan Gershkovich, very much the jewel in the crown of what has happened. The Wall Street reporter who was arrested by Russia in March of last year, held ever since, and charged just last month convicted last month of spying in a Russian court and sentenced to 16 years. As Doug was saying, today pardoned by Vladimir Putin and on his way now back to the United States as part of this prisoner swap. We're joined now by Melinda Haring, the Eurasia specialist at the Atlantic Council. Melinda, thanks for being with us. What does all this tell us about Russia right now?
Hey, Mark, I think what it says is that Vladimir Putin really wanted this one gentleman freed, and he was willing to make a big exchange for it. And I would contest your description of Evan Gershkovich as the crown. Don't forget, Vladimir Kara-Murza just won the Pulitzer Prize, and also Kurmasheva is also a fantastic journalist. I think there was a concentrated campaign behind Evan, and that's why we all know his name. But these other journalists are very serious in their own right. But it says that Putin really, really wanted this deal. He'd been trying for months, and it broke down when Alexei Navalny died. So Putin was intent on that, and he did give a lot. I never thought he would allow Vladimir Kara-Murza to leave Russia.
Melinda, it is always a pleasure to be corrected by you. Thank you for pointing that out, and I completely agree with what you're saying. Alexei Navalny apparently was part of this negotiation, but tragically it didn't happen in time to save his life.
That's right. So your reporters are spot on that this is a super complicated deal. It involves 24 people who've been freed. It involves more than 6 countries, and the deal's been cooking for a long time. But the Germans wouldn't agree to release this notorious Chechen Georgian assassin who'd been in prison since 2019. So that was really the sticking point. And they couldn't get the Germans to agree, and Navalny passed away. But we saw that President Biden really put his neck in and said that this is super important, and he made the deal happen. It's a great day in Washington. It's a great day for these families. It's a great day for the children of Vladimir Kara-Murza. It's a great day for the children of Alsu Kurmasheva. Her daughter just had President Biden sing happy birthday to her. I mean, can you imagine to have your mother freed and to have the President of the United States sing happy birthday to you on the same day? What a day.
What a day indeed. Your smile says it all in many ways. And one can only imagine what the the families of the prisoners and what the prisoners themselves are now thinking. On the Russian side of things, will those prisoners going back, especially the hitman that you've mentioned, those prisoners going back, will they just slip back into their various nefarious roles as before?
So, Mark, that's a big question. What happens to these guys? And I think they'll be rewarded in the system. The hitman has had his documents changed before. He will be taken care of. I think the big message that Putin's persistence with this case in particular, it sends a message, and it's a very ominous message. You can commit a crime in Berlin, and we've got your back, and we will get you out. So Putin is saying we've got impunity. We can kill people in broad daylight in the European Union, and we will take care of our people. It's a sinister message. It's one that gives me a lot of anxiety, but that's the big message that we see today.
And from Putin's perspective, this is a major propaganda victory.
Yeah, it is. He's been trying and trying for this for a while. I think, though, people are getting excited and saying, oh, my God, are Moscow and Washington going to reset relations in the remaining months of Biden's term? No way, Mark. It's not going to happen. The war in Ukraine is the big elephant in the room, and neither side is going to cry uncle. So I expect relations to be tense, tense, tense. The only thing that caused this coincidence where Biden's interests and Putin's interests were overlapping, it was momentary. It was a marriage of convenience, nothing more than that.
Melinda Haring, as always, thank you very much indeed for joining us. We always appreciate your analysis. Thank you very much indeed. Melinda Haring there from the Atlantic Centre's Eurasia Centre.